morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us here at Unreal Fest 2018. Like we just said there. My name is Jeff Goslin. I'm a character artist at Ninja Theory, based in the UK and Cambridge. Now, we've been making games for over 15 years, pretty much, and last August we released Hellblade: Senua's Sacrifice on PS4 and PC. You saw a little bit of that in Tim's talk, but if you're not too familiar with Hellblade, then here's a nice little trailer we put together for the Xbox One version released earlier this month.
You hear them too, right?
They're watching. Can you see them? They're going to do that to you.
We picture fear, and we think of a shadow in the woods, creature in the night.
She's scared. What's happening? Help me.
If only it were that simple.
Baby, you're already dead.
Who are you? She once tried to make them go away.
Mother, do you hear them?
Pretend they weren't real.
Who's there?
But what good is that?
Do you see their faces?
When we are always here.
This is what happens when you listen to the voices of the underworld. They crawl into your soul and rot you from the inside.
With every defeat, the dark rot will grow and soon it will take her soul.
They're in the darkness.
But for now, at least, she still has control of her mind. And she will fulfill her vow.
Don't let this darkness come between us.
Whatever the cost.
The darkness touched you. Everyone could see it in the hollows of your eyes.
What's your name?
A gaze averted from light.
Senua.
You should become a warrior, you know.
You ran from it but brought it nearer. Led it to him. An endless suffering, worse than death. And you wanted to surrender. Abandoned to find peace with the gods. So you will walk into the lair of the beast. Look it in the eye, and you will go to war.
She will save his soul. Even if this time she can't save her own.
It's worth touching on one of the more unique aspects of Hellblade's development in that we're trying to carve out our own development space. It's not indie, that's not AAA, it's what we were calling independent AAA. As our commercial director, Dominic Matthews, puts it, it's about self-publishing AAA quality games are narrower in focus, selling them for a fair price and connecting to your fans in a more meaningful way. It's a place for developers like us who don't fit comfortably into the mega budget AAA space, but we're not full, true indie developers in the traditional sense. I mean, put more simply, as a developer, that means that you're trying to make something that looks and feels as good as a AAA game, but on a fraction of the development resources. Typically at Ninja Theory on games like Devil May Cry and games we'd made before, we had over 80 people, sort of solid, medium-sized, relatively AAA for its time, sort of resource headcounts. And to do that in Hellblade, to make the game with this limited resources, we had to find a lot of creative solutions, a lot of compromises across the board. I mean, that's pretty much the overriding theme of today's presentation. You'll see that from each of us today. We're a bit of a mixed bag in terms of discipline, but we hope this is going to give you more of a broad view of some of the solutions and compromises that we came to on Hellblade. Right, so I'm going to kick off. First off, I'm going to take you through some of the challenges that I faced in creating the Hellblade's enemies. But as part of this, I also hope to sort of shed some light on, I'd come from sort of the big AAA studio kind of environment, like the Ubisofts and EAs and stuff like that, before coming to Ninja Theory. So it was quite a big adjustment, let's say, coming into this smaller team size. I'm a character artist. When I was brought on with the mandate of creating all the enemy characters, as well as helping out with Senua, But on Hellblade, and what became a common theme across the board, was that you had to be a little bit more than just your job title. I'm not going to be going into anything specifically on Unreal today. It's more of an art talk. But I do want to acknowledge the huge role that Unreal has in allowing teams of our size and the bigger sizes to make these huge, amazing games. It was instrumental in allowing us to make Hellblade on the budget that we did. So a little bit about me. I was full-on franchise developer. Prince Persia, Splinter Cells, all that kind of stuff. And before coming to Ninja Theory, I finished up working on Assassin's Creed Unity, leading the character team there and helping to develop one of the upcoming games, Starlink, developed the characters for that. I also did a bit of a shame project of Army of Two Devil's Cartel, but it's only for a few months. Sorry. So coming into Hellblade, I did have some idea of what to expect, having watched the progress in the development diaries like you see here. These are all still available online. Sorry. And it wasn't like two guys making a game in their garage or anything like that, but it was pretty much 15 people on the core team when I arrived. So it was a huge departure from sitting in an office with hundreds of people working as a developer amongst thousands around the world, on a sort of Ubisoft kind of title. And it definitely took a while to adjust to this relative lack of structure. I mean, we didn't even have a producer when we started. We just had to kind of organize ourselves. Many disciplines were the responsibility of just one person, so that person was their own de facto lead, essentially. Do you want to keep looping that one? It's a bit embarrassing for Dom up there. So each person in charge of that discipline had to work out their own pipeline, their own schedule. And when you're largely responsible for the look and feel of a chunk of the game, it was very empowering, but it's also a little bit scary, because if that part doesn't look good, it doesn't feel good, then it's down to you. There's nobody else to sort of hide behind. It's good though. One of the reasons this was possible at all was everybody had a lot of experience on the team. Virtually everybody was 10 to 20 years experience. So we probably most of us had led teams before and you had to do all this kind of stuff. I joined Hellblade about a year into development, and the team had just completed a bit of a reset on the enemy art direction. This is what we had up until that point. This was a kind of a Viking zombie army that was supposed to, the game was based in the Viking underworld of Helheim, so it kind of made sense to have Viking zombie armies. This is really nice work. These concepts are great, but Tamim Antoniades, our creative director, was getting what he called zombie fatigue. So many products were pushing zombies and the undead, and it was becoming a bit of a tired subject. So he wanted to look for something a little bit different. He still wanted to have a horror feel to things, but it was more the idea of having something inwardly disturbing than outwardly grotesque. Some of the key influences he was looking to tap were, on the top left there, you've got the original Wicker Man movie with sort of animalistic, paganistic, shape-shifting kind of stuff. On the top right, Hellraiser with a strong body modification theme. They're cutting themselves, they're wrapping things around them, that kind of stuff. And a terribly crappy low-res image from Lucio Fulci in his zombie work, where just horrible griminess that we wanted to kind of get in there. And around this time, one of our senior artists, Hugues Giboire, he turned Tamim on to an artist called Olivier de Sagazin. This is a sort of video performance art kind of guy, sort of pretty out there, as you'll see. And he transforms himself in front of a camera with all clay and sticks and paint and all this kind of stuff. And this kind of tapped into the slightly sort of out there kind of feel that we wanted to have for these guys. It's sort of, they've gone too far, they've gone to some other place for the enemies. Probably move on. Sorry. So when I look back at it now, this is how I find myself framing the thinking of what informed that. It was nice to just kind of formalize that, because that way you could sort of work out where to go from there, in a sense. So basically it was, what would pre-Christianity Vikings look like had their paganism gone a bit extreme? What if they'd taken their body modification a bit too far? And on top of that, we're seeing these guys, these enemies, through the eyes of Senua. Psychosis can have quite a profound effect on what you see. This can mean distortions of what's there, and also at seeing things other people don't. And further than that, she's seeing these guys, her knowledge of these guys is through the myths and legends of her people. She's a Pict from Orkney. The Vikings described the Picts as being really small, so it makes sense that the Picts described the Vikings as being really large. So when you can add all this stuff together, we can make these guys bigger than they are in reality. We can make them more augmented, more, bizarre looking and stuff. That was kind of the wiggle room that we found to add a more fantastical element rather than just making straight up Vikings, which is nice and all. It's good for a historical game, but we wanted something a bit more than that. So our old art director and concept guy, Alex Tiny, went to work on new concepts with all this stuff in mind, and he came up with this guy known as Horsehead. And then Hugh, at the time, went on to create a 3D model of it. And Tamim felt this had really, like this had gone somewhere that was just more interesting to him, that we felt we could propagate more content from. I just joined the team as we were working on our vertical slice, and I was handed this guy to flesh out the demo a little bit more. And here he is here. If you played the game, you may recognize him as somebody else in the game. If you set his head on fire, yeah, you're good to go. Shortly after this, Alex Tiny left Ninja Theory, and he'd been there for years, and he was one of the main sort of artistic inputs of the whole studio. And so that left a huge concept vacuum. We were pretty much down to like no concept artists at that point, on the team at least. And so in true indie AAA fashion, as it ended up being, we found a way to make it work with a bit of improvisation. And the improvisation was essentially, with no one else available, it was on me. So I was like, okay. I mean, I directed and I directed concept artists before. I'd done a few concepts myself at Ubisoft and EA, but I'm not traditionally trained 2D concept artist. I'm not like a great illustrator. My stuff's not going to make the front page of ArtStation. But I really do love designing characters, and having made so many over the years, I felt I knew what worked visually. And as well as that, I was going to be modeling and texturing these guys, so I felt I could bridge the gap. And sort of the final result would be okay in the end. I just had to sort of do enough to convince people that was the case. So yeah, the idea was take the new art direction that had worked so well in execution. The immediate mandate of that was to take these concepts along with the thinking and the influences that informed them, and just start generating visual ideas. Now, these are not great. I'm going to say that straight up. This is a challenging period for me. The initial sketches kind of they meandered all over the place. I tried all kinds of things, working in 2D and 3D, and the results are obviously pretty hit and miss. There wasn't a lot of specific call-outs from design or narrative at this point, so you just had to kind of design, not for nothing, but just generate visual ideas, which I found really hard, because that was like, to me, fishing for a design as opposed to like seeing it and hunting for it, designing to spec. But to me, our CD was patient, and to be honest, I'm not sure we actually had much more options at that time. So, during this time, new influences came from across the team, and I also brought my own thinking into the mix. That's always the interesting thing when you bring somebody in as another creative, is that hopefully they'll bring something new in there, and ideally they do impart some of their own thinking onto that. For me, the video game industry can be quite inward-looking or quite self-referential, and so ideas can get a little bit exhausted and samey after a while. So as much as possible, I consciously avoid referencing other games. I try not to look at concept art forums too much, because I think they're also referencing each other and looking inward too much. And even towards movies as well, because I think they seem to tap the same kind of references. And that's not the idea, is not to be like too cool for school and just push it away for the sake of it. It's for me, that's essential in finding something fresh. So yeah, for the Hellblade enemies, I sort of looked more towards historical costume, modern fashion stuff, more anything sort of paganistic, cultures that dress up kind of interestingly on their weekends for festivals, and things that had a sort of body modification theme, especially if there's some kind of animal forms involved. So these are some of the key ones. This is the kind of stuff where you have people from different cultures nowadays that dress up in pretty awesome stuff. Some interesting sculptors reusing stuff that's not a straight up animal mask, but they've reused it to make something like an animal mask in that sense. And a really interesting Icelandic videotape artist. So that all kind of ended up resulting in our buddy Valraven here, who made it into the game as one of the bosses. Again, not fantastic, but this was kind of enough to, for the team to get the idea, and I kind of knew that I would be able to execute something better in 3D. What I'm seeing in my head, it's hard for me to communicate in 2D, but in the end, I'm getting something like this. So this is closer to what I wanted to communicate. With making Valraven, I felt like at that point I was actually able to make characters and design characters for Hellblade. If the script or the gameplay called out for a particular character, I think I was able to start work on that kind of stuff. So yeah, in the process of developing a sense of what worked visually, I sort of analyzed it all down again to sort of work out what was the recipe so far, what was actually working. When we liked something, what was the thing that was happening in there? And at the base, they were just still a human. They were just, typically a male figure. Some trashed clothing, and a bunch of crap stuck to them. It was really quite simple in that sense, obviously, but there's a lot you can do with that. So it made sense to work on a human base mesh that then we could then propagate all our content from. It's not my holiday snaps here. the idea with these Viking guys is that they were being seen as these huge, big, massive people. So like the small Picts might have seen them. So world's strongest man, 2 meters plus, 150 kilograms kind of bodies. The mountain Erectus you might recognize there from Mad Max Fury Road in his wrestling garb. So with these guys in mind, I went on to create a base physique here. And from this, we were able to essentially create a whole bunch of characters from that. So this is one of the things that allowed us to make more than typically we would, rather than doing everything bespoke. I also made skinnier and chunkier versions to sort of give us a bit of physiological variety. For all the kind of gunk and junk that I was saying was stuck to them, essentially there would be a glue, if you will, that they would use to stick to them. It's tar, clay, mud, blood, anything liquid that likes to set, essentially. And then for all the junk that they stuck to themselves, we had various sort of classic pagan stuff of, branches, sticks, feathers, bones, skulls, that kind of stuff. Things were starting to come together. We had an established visual direction. We had a healthy stash of reference materials. We had our base mesh to model on, and we were starting to actually get specific callouts for boss characters that we could design too. We could design for them. The only thing, there wasn't that much time, and there was only one of me, essentially. So, after I've modeled something, it needs to get rigged, it needs to get animated, it needs to get implemented in-game. So the lead time for character art is way back there. We generally crunch early and then look really lazy later on, basically. And at that time, the combat had an overhaul. We'd basically consciously decided to sort of pare it back a little bit, let the experiential, the visual, the kind of narrative elements come to the fore, sort of simplified it a little bit, and that trimmed the enemy count, which again also made it possible. So there's another one of those kind of compromises. Ultimately, if you can't make everything, then try and work out what you can cut. Another thing that helped us in getting things done quickly was to opt to design in 3D. I'd done a little bit of 2D stuff, I'd done a little bit of 3D stuff, but ultimately the 3D stuff gave you the advantage of you assess these characters from different silhouettes. You weren't just stuck to this one 2D concept, with the perfect pose, the hair going, the wind going. That's not reflective of what you get in game typically. This is closer, in fact, as much as this isn't particularly exciting. You can check how the lighting's working on it. You can kick it into Unreal and actually see how it looks against existing characters, existing levels, backgrounds, lighting setups and stuff. It's a lot more indicative of what you're going to see than a really nice painting. And it's a huge time saver once you've got that signed off. I mean, if I straighten this guy out into his bind pose, then essentially I can start work on him. Just got to refine things down a little bit. So the kind of 3D concept pipeline that emerged from that was that I would cast the physiology, or physique. You get it posed by the animators, because they're quite good at that. And this would just be a speculative combat idle pose. So, the typical pose that you see a character from, in most cases, when you approach them, and while they're not doing anything during combat. And then essentially dress it up. So in ZBrush and other 3D packages, Marvelous Designer, I would dress this guy up. He's a relatively simple thing, but I take scans, I take things I'd made before, and kind of collage all this stuff together. And this actually kind of communicated the sense of what these characters were about even more, in a sense, because they weren't going to the house of Viking enemies to go and get their awesome outfit. They were just a little bit out there and sticking stuff to them. So with a quick poly reduction, you get that into Engine, again, sort of review it and see how it looks with the lighting and the camera and stuff like that. And then once we got to a good point with that, we would then do a screen grab, and then I'd just paint over it, just to get a sense of the materials and the textures and sort of the other visual elements that were missing from the flat shaded gray 3D concept. And the feedback loop on this was super tight. I mean, you had myself, the main animator, the main combat designer, and tech art. So they were all getting a chance to look at this stuff, make a call out on things that were potentially going to trip them up later, or things that they knew that the technology couldn't do. There's only so much you can do with cloth simulation. And if a character, if a concept artist comes up with somebody in a full clothing outfit, and the idea is these robes are all going to flap around, that's probably not going to happen. You kind of need to keep yourself on the loincloth and capes sort of route. Once we got to a nice place with our feedback loop on that, we would show it to our creative director. Once he worked on his feedback, that was it signed off. And the final result wasn't too bad an image, but it's, this is still not like super amazing concept art. It's nice that we get to show this today, but we weren't throwing this up on the website. But the in-game final model is something closer to what I'm seeing. That's from Unreal. And things did still change in the modeling process. It wasn't just here it is, he's done. The paint over concepts that we did, time meant that some things were at better levels of maturity than others. Some didn't even get a full-on concept pass. You just had to make this 3D model. And this is kind of, where indie, or at least our independent AAA approach sort of really shone for me. You were you were free to try things. And ultimately, especially if I was the only one making these things, as long as it was only an aesthetic change, I was the only person who's going to get screwed up by last minute changes. It was on me. It's not like if I made a call on this, like 3 other guys have to then go and work extra time to get something done that I've had some little creative pipe dream on. So yeah, the degree of freedom was fantastic, to be honest. And it's not as feasible on AAA, I wouldn't say, on the big scale stuff. I mean, that's fair enough, obviously, but there's not always the time or necessity to follow the ideal route. Fafnir, one of the other bosses in the game, that's as far as I got. I mean, it's really not that. It's just enough maybe to convince somebody that we can do something with that. But we just had to get cracking. It's towards the end of the development. You just got to make it. And in the case of a couple of sideline ones, like for Hela, the main boss of the game, if you will, she was just basically Senua's body, and then we painted over the top of that. So yeah, in choosing to do that, that's how we were saving time, essentially. But yeah, that's pretty much it. I mean, there's 4 of us speaking today, so we're trying to keep it pretty short. I just want to convey sort of the larger lessons of coming from AAA down to indie. There's not really a large lesson as such, it's just my personal take on it. But as much as you have to be creative in all the things that you do in any game studio, I think when you're on these little budgets, when you've only got so many people on the project, you just need to be extra creative about that with that limited resource. It's true, like I said, it's true on AAA, but it's extra on these smaller budgets. And I think as well, coming from like the more structured thing of AAA and all these producers and all that kind of stuff, you got to be ready to embrace a little bit more uncertainty and kind of roll with that. I became quite unstuck a few times where I was like, why isn't this organized? Why isn't this all working? But ultimately, it led to interesting results. But yeah, that's pretty much it for me. I'm going to pass you over to Matt here.
Hey, so my name's Matt. I'm the tech artist at Ninja Theory. And so at Ninja Theory, the approach has always been to try and think on our feet and to find genuine solutions to problems. But with Hellblade, we pushed this even further, and we wanted to challenge our own preconceptions of not just what's possible with a small team, but what's possible with games. And we didn't want to compromise on quality. And so this was the challenge, right? How can we deliver an amazing experience to a really high quality level with just 15 to 20 people? And so one of the things about working with this small team was that any one group within it was already really highly experienced and multidisciplined. And this helped us make good calls where we could feed that experience into the design process at a really early stage. And this was instrumental in ensuring that the art direction didn't feel compromised as a result of limited resources. And so you might notice, for example, that the enemies have no facial features. And this was a key design aesthetic, but it was one born out of very real resource restrictions. An important kind of counterbalance to this was that right throughout the project, we encouraged experimentation, and with it, a willingness to fail. And this led us to explore paths that we might have otherwise just discounted out of hand. And you can see this through the use of F&V for the secondary narrative-driven characters. We understood fairly early, before Hellblade even really became Hellblade, that being able to emotionally connect with Senua was going to be the cornerstone of the experience. But for this to really be successful, the quality of the facial animation and articulation was going to be way more complex than anything we'd attempted before. So early attempts at facial systems were essentially an evolution of DMC-level technology, but trying to use acquired data as a source for generating the base model and the facts poses. And so here on the left, you can see an early test output from Agisoft PhotoScan compared to the output from 3-lateral scanner at this time. And at this point, we're recording a fact sequence of our actress with an array of 5 GoPro cameras. And then we're reconstructing around 60 poses from a series of picked frames. And that's approximately double the number we had for Dante. To create each pose, we mapped a low-resolution cage mesh to an equivalent marker set present in the scan data. And then we transferred this to our base model using a wrap deformer. It became clear pretty quickly that this approach wasn't going to give us the quality and the robustness we needed. And there are a few reasons for this. Firstly, the scan data is simply not high enough quality. Secondly, the transfer method we were using failed to effectively utilize the scan data that we did have. And finally, we had no real ability to extract sensible texture information from the scan process. And so the result was that this workflow was still highly reliant on traditional hand authoring techniques. And so we came to understand that to hit the level of quality we knew that we really needed, it was going to consume a huge amount of internal resources, and those resources we just didn't have. And so this led us to look for partners that could help, that really understood and shared our creative vision. And the guys that we partnered with were 3-lateral, who helped out with facial scanning and the facial rig, and Cubic Motion, who provided the facial animation solver. And as you can see here, the jump in quality was immediate and significant. And you should also get a basic sense of the increase in rig complexity that underpinned it. But really, the impact extended far beyond just the one asset. The level of quality we now saw in Senua set the tone for the entire project, and it raised the level of expectation we placed upon ourselves. We also made significant changes to how we set up our character rigs, and we moved away from a system of creating bespoke character rigs for pretty much everything, and adopted a rig class structure. And this had a huge positive impact across pretty much all areas. DMC had 32 characters and 23 unique rigs. Hellblade had 16 characters, 12 of those were rigged, and those 12 were derived from just 3 base rig classes, male, female, and quadruped. And so this makes character setup and character creation in general much more efficient as we're removing repetitive work. And it dramatically increases the scope for asset sharing, either as a template for something new, or even sharing an entire animation set across characters. So each parent rig is built using a scripted process. It's uniquely proportioned and contains all the core, non-character specific functionality. Within each is an approximation of 3 different build types, slim, medium, and heavy, with high quality skin weighting that's used as a starting point for subsequent rigs. When we build a new rig class, we spend a lot of time inside an iterative loop with character, animation, and tech to refine the base topology, proportions, control, and deformation setups. Putting a lot of time into getting this right early on is really important, as it pays huge dividends over the lifetime of the project, particularly for the animation guys, so you can be sure that a new rig in a particular class is going to work straight out of the box. It also means that we reduce departmental dependencies on new asset generation to a minimum. And it means that we can complete the majority of character, animation, and technical work in parallel. So each new character begins with a reference of the parent rig class and then has character-specific functionality added over the top of it. And this is restricted to secondary deformation systems only. So here with this example of Pighead, on the left you can see him implemented with just inherited core functionality. And then in the center with additional joint-based deformation systems added over the top, so things like belts, joints for dynamic systems in UE4. And finally with the Apex clothing assets added on the top. All of the enemies were exported to a single skeleton in UE4, and that helped facilitate animation sharing in engine. So Hellblade shipped on UE4 4.15, so we were limited to using the MyDCC plugin for authoring Apex assets. And one of the limiting factors of using Apex on your models is that it's limited to 4 influences per vert on the models. And so to help us kind of manage this and to modify the weights to within this restriction, we use a custom heat map and weights redistribution tool in Maya. And so we use the heat map to visualize the distribution of IPV across the mesh. And as you can see here on the left, there are some out-of-range values colored white. And then we use our custom redistribution tool to do a pre-pass on the weights, the result of which you can see on the right. One of the potentially more interesting use cases for runtime dynamics was a bit of a last-minute experiment on Fafnir. And I was interested to see to what extent Apex and Anon dynamics could be used to represent heavy muscle mass and skin around the shoulder area. It was pretty late in the project, so this was a skeleton. It's pretty basic. It's only got a few extra deformation joints on it, which you can see colored in red. And to a subset of these, I added Anon dynamics nodes. And this was for the low-frequency procedural motion and to try and communicate a feeling of mass. For the high-frequency motion and for the loose skin, I assigned a couple of areas of mesh as Apex assets, which you can see here. Painted backstop values to maintain mesh volume by restricted simulated movement along the inverse mesh normal. So the bright pink areas that you can't really see on this projector are fully restricted to a value of 0 around areas of high muscle tone, and then less restrictive in less toned areas, which you can see kind of on the flank. And so this is the result. It suffers a little bit from a lack of extra deformation helpers from the top of the arm going into the shoulder that would have helped maintain the muscle forms a little bit. But for the most part, it's quite effective. If you look closely, you can sometimes see little skin tears around the border of the Apex mesh. But these weren't really noticeable in engine, in game at least, so that was fine. So some of the key missteps came from early attempts at using acquired data in our art pipelines. And as well as experimenting with facial capture, We also had a cracker using the Artec hand scanner. And so we used this to generate a full body scan of Melina, which went on to form the basis of the final Senua model. And as you can see here, during some R&D into generating corrective shapes to help improve our character deformation. And some of this work we did actually take forward and generate a set of neck corrective shapes for Senua. There are a bunch of issues with this that prevented it from being really useful. So patch misalignment issues were really common, although with practice it was possible to get reasonable reference quality meshes, even on a non-static subject. But in general, the mesh data generated lacked the robustness and the level of detail that you might expect if you're familiar with DSLR-based photogrammetry workflows. And we certainly struggled to capture any kind of micro-level detail. Perhaps the biggest issue, though, is that the texture maps generated from this process are basically unusable, certainly for any sensible PBR-based workflows. And really, throughout Hellblade, we've come to understand that for the quality of acquired data has to be really, really high for it to be useful. And being able to capture the mesh is just one small part of this. Being able to capture high-quality maps that we can properly color manage, delight, and process for PBR workflows is key to the overall result. And to wrap up, I just want to highlight the three main areas that I think are going to underpin our art development, art pipeline development going forwards. And firstly, although, despite our early missteps with data acquisition, we think it's going to feature much more heavily. For high-value assets requiring specialist scanning facilities, we'll continue to work with partners. But we see this as the foundation for a large amount of our art assets going forwards. And we're looking into ways that we can work with this data efficiently, using maps to inform a more substance-based workflow. And we also plan to build a DSLR-based material patch scanner based on the algorithmic Your Phone is a Material Scanner tutorial. One of the most eye-opening experiences and informative experiences on the whole project was when we worked with Epic on the 2016 GDC Live Drive demo. And it was during this time that we were introduced to the kind of formal look development workflows that have been established in the VFX industries for a while now. And although we're very proud of Hellblade, we did have issues trying to maintain a final high image quality right across the game. And we sometimes found it hard to balance lighting and color grading because assets could sometimes respond inconsistently to different lighting scenarios. And where issues existed, it was hard to decouple between lighting, shader, and textural issues. And so we're working hard on making improvements and establishing better workflows and readiness for new projects. And finally, we're also trying to further our understanding of formal color management practices and the practical implications of this on our art pipelines. From relatively simple cases of properly color managing ground truth reference to homogenizing the rendering intent of multiple software packages, through to even looking at how we can implement a fully linear ASIS framework within UE4. Good color management is often overlooked in our industry, but is hugely important. Even more so as we look to author great content that looks good across multiple output device capabilities. And fundamentally, as a studio, we want to get away from this old frame of reference, which is, it looks good for a game, because, at this point, we're already making excuses for it. And thank you very much for listening. I'm going to pass you over to Bash.
Thank you, Matt. So the points in this list you see were some of the challenges we faced and set out to solve on Hellblade. We had to set up our meeting room as our performance stage, and we had to capture 60 minutes of cutscenes for the game. For like 80% of the project, I was the only cinematic person on the project. My job was ranging from anything for organizing demo cap shoots to Unreal implementation and lighting. The direction of the game was to blend seamlessly from game to cutscene without doing any camera cuts. This meant doing the same thing as the latest God of War. Everything blends from one thing to another, giving the player a very fluid experience. We also integrated live action into the scenes for all the vision sequences for Senua. So we did a lot of experimentation because before we settled on our current pipeline, this was ranging anything from 3D printing to buying IKEA poles to support the wide-angle cameras. We also recorded facial with GoPros.
And we also try to make our own HMC. So we tested a lot of different headsets before settling on a Technoprops rig. This rig is a stereo camera system recording 1080 FPS with a modified Blackmagic recorder. So why we did all this? In past projects, we always handed out the performance capture to external companies. And this was very convenient because we received all the data back. We didn't have to care about the shooting process, data cleaning, and everything that's involved. But this time, the nature of our project dictated that we try and do everything in-house with only a few exceptions. This meant that we had to build our own mocap studio within our meeting room. So there was only a small team on Hellblade, and I was the lucky one setting up the performance stage. And everything was synced, then time-coded with the facial recorder and the director camera and the audio that was controlling everything from one of the corners of the room. Usually we had 4 people in on the shoots. Melina, our actress, Tamim, the director, and David, the audio guy. And I was controlling the whole setup. The only thing we couldn't do in this room because of the ceiling height were the more complicated combat moves. So we had, like, as far as I can remember, we had like 5, 6 cinematic sessions. Each lasted for at least a few days. And the turnaround time for more simple scenes with a simple Unreal setup only took a day. So yeah, worth mentioning that we didn't really care about anything that was outside of the shot. We did this to save time on data cleaning and processing. We wanted to be very, very strict on our changes, but obviously we couldn't avoid them in the end. And some of these changes ended up being very, very painful, but I still think we saved a lot of time working like this. So when we finished with the shoot, we did a take selection with Tamim and started working on the edit videos and data cleaning. And later on, we imported everything into Motion Builder and Maya, and then our basic blueprint set up in Unreal. And in the meantime, we sent all the time-coded facial data to Cubic Motion. And when we got them, we implemented them in Maya and we exported the whole scene. So jumping to Unreal, back when we started, there was no sequencer. So all of our scenes are using old-school Matinee. And there was no coder help, so I've done my experimentations for the cinematic blends, and this became the base of our system. Obviously, later on, when I got the help, everything became much smaller and simpler to use, and we kept on adding stuff to minimize the work needed for getting the new scenes into Unreal. So my first tests were pretty simple. The aim was to just approach a trigger point and having a seamless blend for Senua and the camera. Later, for obvious reasons, we had to force Senua into a specific orientation to match up with the layout. We also steer the player with visual cues, but you can still approach the cutscene from any possible angle. And this system works surprisingly well. Even though it's not very smart, we managed to get it working for all of our scenes. So nothing is super fancy here. When you hit a trigger, you can control the blend time and the curvature separately for Senua and for the camera. And I have to say that we didn't really plan for this approach. So we assumed that we will do the usual. When you hit a trigger, we just do a cut and play the cutscene. This also changed a lot of things because there's less space to cheat. You can't hide things on cuts. And in the flashback scenes, we also had to blend Senua back to a younger state where she doesn't have any facial paint, wounds, or dirt. And we also blending lighting and post as well. So this brings us to the lighting. The in-game environment lighting It looks amazing, but it doesn't always work for cutscenes, especially in our case because we had so many close-up shots on Senua. So as I mentioned before, we had to blend seamlessly from the in-game parts to the cutscene, and we knew that we can't really change the in-game lighting when doing this. So during the blend, we toned down, sometimes completely turned off the in-game lighting affecting Senua. So this gave us a clean slate so that we can light Senua to our needs, and optimization was a lot easier as well. So we've done this through a camera property and the combination of blending the post and also make good use of the lighting channels. The game was mostly with very soft lights, so we could play with the moods and just to bring out the subtleties of Melina's performance. And the atmosphere was very, very claustrophobic and with a very tight depth of field. Okay, so it became clear pretty soon that we will not have the budget to add the same kind of details to the supporting cast as we have on Melina's character, Senua. And a bit later, it became evident that we have to find alternative ways to portray the supporting cast. So we tried a lot of things, from blurring simple images to 360 videos, anything we could think of within the budget. One of the first tests was to shoot Mel in front of a green screen and just see what we can do with it in post. This was the time when we were working on the vertical slice of the game, trying to figure out what could work for the vision sequences, and so we just tried to project the footage onto the trees. Taking the footage further, we used it in the climax of our vertical slice. Senua is walking up to a fractured stone head, and that head didn't really have any facial features, so we just used our footage and projected it onto the mesh. We also looked into creating 360 videos. The plan was to shoot on real locations with real actors, and we 3D printed a GoPro mount which held 5 cameras, and we stitched the footage together and used it. We were planning to use it in the game around projecting it around Senua, but this proved to be a bit more complicated than what we needed at the time, so we abandoned this idea. So we went back to the green screen method, got our actors in costumes, and lit them in our meeting room as the best we could. And once we had the footage, we ran it through After Effects, rotoscoped, keyed, and added some post-processing. And because we already shot all the scenes with Mel that needed the actors, we had to make dramatic changes to those scenes to make these live plates fit. So we found a language that worked quite well for these scenes. So we change the field of view every time they come on and push in with the camera. This makes the image a bit flat, so all the live plates integrate with the original scene a lot better. And also keep in mind that these vision sequences, we never aim to do like a perfectly composited image. All we've done is match the angle of the camera and the size of the actor and kept the camera fairly static when they are on screen. So after we finalized the scenes in Maya, we implemented the plates into the Unreal scene. All of them acted as a light source to give the feel that they are only visions. And another pass was done by VFX, adding radio blurs and out-of-focus effects, and this made the last click to these scenes. So yeah, that's it from me.
Thanks very much, Balash. Hi, I'm Mark. I'm the lead VFX artist at Ninja Theory. I'm going to dive into a few areas of Hellblade where UE4 really helped me as the single VFX artist on the project achieve high-quality visuals. So I'm going to be covering a wide range of tasks and hopefully give you an insight into how diverse the VFX role became. So one of the pillars of Hellblade was seeing the world through the eyes of Senua. And that meant visualizing some of the manifestations of her psychosis. And for those who don't know, throughout the entire development of Hellblade, the team was talking to mental health professors, advisors, and people with lived experiences. Now, off the back of these discussions, I set out some time to try and interpret the visual side of what I'd been told. So I did a lot of experimentation with post-process materials, and I would regularly show these to our advisors to see if I was getting anywhere near what they had described or experienced. So I played about with flow maps, world-projected textures, pretty much every texture buffer I had available to me. I ended up with a folder full of material tests. Many of them didn't actually make it into the final game, but the knowledge you gain from working through this process is invaluable. And I've actually used a lot of the ideas from these materials in other projects since Hellblade, so try not to get upset if you're working on something and it just gets cut, because you never know when you might need that in the future. So one of the key post materials used throughout the game we internally named awareness. And the main visual component is that it appears to refract the image to the borders of the screen. Now, this effect was achieved using a custom radial blur node, but instead of keeping the spread of pixels pretty small, I expanded the distances so it wraps back around on itself. And this created a sort of interesting fractured refraction style effect. Variations of this were used for a lot of different scenes in the game, including like flashbacks and puzzle solving. Here, I'm just playing about with some of the parameters that I exposed, so you can see like some super extreme results. So this is the material graph for that post material. The most expensive part was the custom radial blur node, which contained the shader code for that. The rest of the material, it has various color controls, blur size and intensity, and there's also a part down the bottom there that uses the custom stencil of Senua to mask her out of the effect. And this custom stencil became really important for us because we were trying to portray what Senua was seeing, so we didn't want the effect to manipulate her on screen, just the environment. Other post materials, as I said, we use flow maps, world-projected textures, and a variety of other ways just to play about with the UVs of the screen. And it's amazing what you can achieve in a post-process material. A lot of times, this might be accidental as well, so it's always good to make time to experiment. You never know what kind of fun effects you might end up with by doing some really bad maths. So let's move on to atmosphere and weather. I knew it was going to be very important for us to portray different moods and feelings across the game. I decided one way of doing this was through lighting, atmosphere, and weather. And when I started working on this task, we were still very early in pre-production, so I didn't have any set levels to work with. So it made sense to come up with a system that could be used anywhere and wasn't scene dependent. And ultimately, this proved crucial, as there are a lot of changes throughout the project, and with the story, level design, cinematics. So making a dynamic system meant that it wasn't a problem when someone would change their mind and go, this is no longer a sunny morning, it needs to be a stormy night. I did not have a coder available to me when I began this. They were supposedly working on more important tasks, although honestly I can't imagine anything more important than making cool VFX. So I had to rely on blueprints to make this myself. The main idea was simple. Have an event that triggers a lerp from one set of values to another over a predetermined time. And ultimately, I wanted to drive lighting values, fog values, rain particles, character and environment materials. So started out, made a blueprint class that would contain all the variables I wanted to change, such as light intensity, light color, fog density and height, that kind of thing. And from there, all I needed was an event that grabbed the new values and blended to them from the existing values. One tip here, I found that using just a straight lerp, it felt really abrupt at the start and the end. So pass your values through an S-curve and you get a really nice ease in, ease out feel. And if you haven't worked with blueprints before, basically don't be scared of them. Start simple, just create one bit of functionality at a time. And as you get more used to them, you can think of new ways of doing things, better ways of doing things. You can go back and optimize your earlier work. When I look back on some of the blueprints I made in Hellblade now, I question how hungover I was when I made them, because I could definitely make them better now. So once the main blueprint was working as I expected, I continued to add functionality. I made rain from GPU particle sprites, attached them to the camera, and then used the blueprint to drive spawn rate, size, velocity, etc. In Maya, I generated global vector fields for the levels, so the leaves, ash, other debris would blow around the environment a bit more realistically, sort of taking into account the collision of the objects. I used material parameter collections, hooked them up to Senua and the environment, so that as the rain got heavier, I could then drive those materials to make them start looking wet. And for the lightning, I basically got the blueprint to hijack the current active directional light and flash the intensity of it. To begin with, I did try out a system where I used a separate light for the lightning, so I could have random rotations, and it looked completely awesome, because you had shadows scattering all over the place, but sadly it proved too expensive to keep in the final game. Hellblade actually shipped with this entire system still in blueprint. It didn't get converted to code. We probably just ran out of time, I imagine. So although it wasn't as fast as it could have been, I did a few key things to make sure it did run okay. So branching the logic where you could, disabling tick on any blueprints as soon as it doesn't need updating. Now we get on to the good stuff, fire. Everyone loves a bit of fire. So very near the start of the project, we knew we were going to have a section where Senua faces off against Cert, the fire giant. But we hadn't fleshed out a lead up to this. So I began some R&D to see if I could create a scene that was completely on fire. This is one of the scenes from the finished game. So I took the approach of generating fluid simulations in Maya. And it doesn't really matter which bit of software you use to do this, as long as it gives you the results you need. We now mostly use Houdini at Ninja Theory, but at the time we were making this, I only really knew the Maya side of things, so that's what I used. So the key bits of information I wanted on my texture sheet were the alpha channel of the fire and the temperature. I wasn't bothered about the diffuse color, as I would define that in Unreal later on. So rendered out the sprites, then in Photoshop, channel packed the temperature into the red channel, the alpha into green, and completely ditched the alpha channel. And this saved me around 10 meg per 4K texture with bitmaps, so it was well worth doing. And as I said just now, I wasn't interested in the diffuse color pass, and that's because Unreal has this black body node. And essentially, black body node is a color ramp, and you can remap your grayscale temperature channel to an RGB color that the Kelvin temperature scale would give you. So the material graph for one of the base fire sprites, as you can see, it's really simple. And this is because it would be used for the bulk of the fire that's on screen. So keeping the instruction count down was really important. Basically, you've got the red temperature channel multiplied by a scalar parameter to bring it into a reasonable range. Then I also have a bias, which allows me to shift the range up and down the color ramp, so I can fine-tune it for whichever scene it's in. Other than that, there's a depth fade to stop hard intersections, and of course, it's all multiplied with the particle color parameter node, so you can control it in Cascade, or soon Niagara. And you can obviously add loads of extra functionality and quality to this. So you could use flow maps or UV distortion to break up the repetition of a flipbook. You could use world position offset if you're planning on mapping it to a tessellated mesh and you want a bit more 3D movement. If you're using axis lock sprites, for example, you might want to look about some angle-based fading, so as the camera turns, you don't see that hard edge. So here's just a few of the particle systems that made it in. To be honest, they're pretty standard. Used a combination of camera-facing sprites, axis-lock sprites, GPU particles for embers and ash, but also made sure to use the flipbook cutout option and made LODs for every single particle system. This is obviously important for performance reasons, reducing overdraw, that kind of thing. So as I knew the design of the levels was likely to change during development, I made a few blueprints to help me reduce time to place particle systems around the world. One of the most useful examples of this is a simple spline-based placement tool. Allowed me to drag out points in the level and just populate it with particle systems. And this was achieved with an actor blueprint using the construction script to create the logic I wanted, such as number of emitters, size variants, angle variants, orientation options, etc. And as I said earlier, start super simple with this stuff. Get the blueprint to do one thing, and then add extra bits of functionality as you think of it. So in this case, I just started out by getting an emitter to spawn at intervals along the spline. Then I started adding the random variation. And finally, to bring the whole scene together, there needs to be a pass on lighting and post. Now, we'd implemented our own version of volumetric fog before it was available in UE4. Part of our system, we could place extra volumes around the level to add to the fog density and fog color. I also added a post-process material, which had some screen space and world-projected smoke, and this further adds to the density of the scene and brings it all together. So concluding this, I think working as a small team, it's really important that you find ways of reusing assets, and I think that's relevant across all disciplines. You're not going to have the time or the resource to create everything bespoke. Blueprints are part of this as well. In our case, the game changed so much over the 3 years. Script rewrites, level design changes. It meant that if we hadn't created these blueprints to help us author the world, we would have been in all kinds of trouble. And the freedom of self-publishing did mean we had time to experiment. We weren't really locked to sort of publisher milestones. And this led to us coming up with all kinds of creative solutions. And that fed back into the story, not just the visuals and design side of things. So what I'm going to do is finish up. We've got this nice video montage of the 3 years of development of Hellblade crammed into a couple of minutes. So just like to thank you all for coming to listen to this talk. Thank you, Epic, for creating this conference as well.